Good day. In this video, I'd like to show you how to set up a PetaSAN storage cluster. PetaSAN is actually quite easy to install and to operate. Before we start, we need to design our cluster network. I went ahead and created a diagram here. Okay, it lists here on the left, you see 5 different subnets that PetaSAN requires in order to operate. The first one is the management subnet, and this is where all the management traffic happens. The second and third are subnets dedicated to iSCSI traffic. This is where the client initiators communicate with the iSCSI targets on PetaSAN. Lastly, there are 2 subnets internal for PetaSAN's internal usage. We call them the backend 1 and backend 2 subnets. It's not really important for the administrator to know the internals of these subnets, but it's important for him to correctly assign the subnet addresses. In our demo, we will be using 10.0.1.0 for the management subnet, 2.0 for the iSCSI1 subnet, 3.0 for the iSCSI2 subnets. For the backend subnets, we'll be using 4.0 and 5.0. In our demo, we will be using a 3-node cluster. You can see them here on the right side there. The first one will be called PS node 01. The second is PS node 02, and the third is 03. Each of these hosts would contain 5 physical network interface cards NICs. Each NIC will be mapped to one of the subnets that we talked about. Actually, this makes it easier to have a one-to-one mapping, but in real life, it's possible to use fewer than 5 physical NICs. The minimum is 2. In such case, we would need to map more than one subnet to each physical NIC. But to make things simpler, and also because we will be using a VMware desktop environment, which doesn't really like mixing subnets on the VMware interfaces, so we will be using a one-to-one mapping. So for the first node, PS node 01, we will assign the IP address on the management network as 10.0.1.11. For the backend WAN interface, 10.0.4.11, and backend 2 interface would be 10.0.5.11. So you can see that they're all ending, the IPs are ending with a .11. On the second node, the IPs would be ending with .12. The third node would end with .13. Now you may be wondering why we left out the iSCSI subnets. And basically the iSCSI subnets would contain virtual or dynamic IPs assigned by the PetaSAN system for clients to communicate with their iSCSI targets. They need to be dynamic so that whenever, in case of any node failures, these virtual IPs would be dynamically moved from one node to another. So they're not fixed, and the administrator does not need to assign them. All we need to do is to define the subnet range and mask. Okay, so let us see our virtual VM environment. So these are the 3 nodes that we will use. Each node would have 2 gigs of RAM, and this is of course for testing, and it's very, very low in terms of production. We do have some recommendations in our hardware recommendation guides. For the storage, we will be using 3 64 gigs disks. 1 will be used for the system, and 2 would be used for the data storage for PetaSAN. Lastly, you can see the 5 different NICs that we have talked about. Each one maps to a VMware subnet. And I can show you also the network editor in VMware to show you that we are using these 5 host-only networks, and these are the subnets that we talked about in our diagram. Okay, so we're ready to start. So we will fire up the first node and install the PetaSAN through the PetaSAN CD. And also, while this is running, we can also start the other 2 nodes. Okay, first page is some licensing. Just say yes. And then we need to define the network configuration. First, the host name. So we'll call it, our first host name is PS node 01. And then the IP address, I'll quickly just do some cheating there. And basically, we'll need to define for our management interface a 10.0.1.11 with a subnet of mask 255.255.0. Okay, so 10.0.1.11. And for the gateway, strictly speaking, PetaSAN doesn't require a real gateway for external access. It does, however, need it in case we want to access an external time sync server that is external to the PetaSAN networks. It's also be used in the future for things like sending email alarms and doing software upgrades and so on. So if you do have a real gateway, it will be better. So we'll be using 10.0.1.1. We also need to select which interface out of the 5 that will be used for the management networks, and in our case, it's going to be the first one. For the system installation disk, we can pick anyone, but we will, for our test demo, we'll be picking the first disk and leave the other 2 for the PetaSAN storage. And then we need to specify our time setup. You should try to be as accurate as possible, especially in case that you will not be syncing externally to an external time server. So try to be as accurate as possible. In case, I'll just add 2 hours here. Also, we need to define the time zones. I'm in Cairo, Egypt, so I'll press E. So basically, just press the country code so that you can jump to the country code quickly. Okay, so that's it for our setup. It asks us that, of course, we will be formatting the disks. And that's it for the first. So let's move to the second node. Again, we need to agree on the license, of course, and then select our host name, which is PS node 02. We use our first interface for management. And then for the network IP, just to show you again, we'll be using 10.0.1.12. Okay. Again, the gateway is optional to put a real gateway. We choose the first disk for our installation disk. Again, setting up the time. And we do the third node. Similarly, I think by now we know the host names and so on. The IP is 10.0.1.13. First system disk for the system. Okay. And just press the first letter of your country to jump and then select the country and time zone. Okay, the first one is just about done. In installation, it takes about 5 minutes. Okay, once done, it tells us that it's the installation is complete. We need to reboot. We just reboot here. Okay, once installation is done on a particular node, we'll get a console screen. And on the top, it tells us that this node needs to be deployed. And I'll just show you, okay, here, there is a URL, which is the node's IP address followed by port 5001. So this is the URL for the deployment wizard. It's a web-based application that continues our deployment of this node. So let us open a browser and go to port 5001 for node 1. The first step is the wizard asks us what we would like to do, whether we would like to create a cluster or we would like to join an existing cluster. In our case, it's our first node, so we would like to create a new cluster. We then specify the cluster name, for example, demo, and password. We then need to define the network settings for our cluster. First, we need to define the mapping between the different subnets and their interfaces. So for iSCSI subnet 1, we would map it to Ethernet 1. iSCSI subnet 2, we would map it to the Ethernet 2 interface. The backend 1 would map to Ethernet 3. The backend 2 would map to Ethernet 4. Again, all this was in the previous diagram. We also need to define the subnets for the backend 1 and backend 2 interfaces, which is 10.0.4.0 with a mask of 255.255.255.0. And for the backend 2, it's 10.0.5.0 and mask of 255.255.255.0. Next, we need to define the current node IP address for the backend 1 and backend 2 interfaces. And for our case, it's going to be 10.0.4.11, 10.0.5.11. Then we are presented with a wizard step asking us which services we would like to run on this node. In our case, we would just use the default of running all services. In a production environment, you may want to run specific services on specific nodes for better load balancing. There's also a warning sign here telling us that be careful that all disks in the local machine would be used for the PetaSAN system. So of course, if you have any disk that contains data, please remove them before proceeding. Then we click next. And this is the final step, and it tells us that the node has been successfully deployed. However, in PetaSAN, in order to get a cluster up and running, you actually need a minimum of 3 nodes. So this node started a cluster, but the cluster would not run until 2 other nodes join in. So this node will be waiting for them to join. So let's go back and see our installer for the second and third node. I think it's, of course, it should be done by now. So we'll reboot them. Okay, reboot. And also our third node. Reboot. And now we will be accessing, once the second node boots up, we will be accessing its deployment wizard. And and instruct it to join the cluster to the first node. So we can also see that from the console screen of the second node, it tells us the address of the deployment wizard, which is basically the address of the node on port 5001. So let's again open the browser and go to the second node, port 5001. And in our first step, in this case, we will not create a new cluster. We would select joining the existing cluster, which is the second choice here. And then it asks us, okay, where is the management node that you would like to join? So we would specify the IP address of the first node, which is 10.0.1.11. And then it is required to correctly put the password for the cluster, otherwise we would not be allowed to join in. Okay. Then we would need to define the current node, which is the second node's backend 1 and backend 2 IP addresses, which is 10.0.4.12, 10.0.5.12. Again, it asks us which services we want to run, so we just leave the defaults. It does some synchronization with the first node. And it's successful. And it tells us that right now there are 2 nodes in the cluster and another node is required to join in before the cluster can be up and running. So we go to the deployment wizard for the third node. Again, we will be joining a cluster and then specifying the IP address of the first node. We can also input the IP address of the second node, but in this case, just put the first node. Specify the cluster password. Now the backend IP of the current node, the third node, which is 10.0.4.13, 10.0.5.13. Again, leave all the services. And the final step will actually take some time because right now the wizard is going to build the entire cluster. So it's going to take actually more than a couple of minutes, depending on how many disks you have. It actually formats the disks and so on. So right now it's a good time to take a break and leave it and then come back when it's done. Once the deployment wizard completes, we now have a working cluster. We can manage it through the management interface, which is accessed at port 5000. So port 5001 is used for the node deployment wizard, and port 5000 is used for managing the cluster. So we can either type in the URL for the management interface, or we can just click on one of the hyperlinks. It shows us the login screen for the management interface. The first time we log in, we need to specify admin as the user, and the password is just simply password. Of course, once we log in, we can change that. We can add users, we can add administrators, and so on. The landing page for our management interface is a dashboard which shows us some of the health status of the cluster and some statistics. For example, it shows us that we have 6 disks in the cluster and they're all up. It also shows us some different charts that we can track the performance of the cluster and so on. Before we create our iSCSI disks, it's important for us to correctly configure the iSCSI subnets. We do that through the configuration menu on the left. We choose iSCSI settings. Here we can define the base IQN that will be used for our iSCSI targets, and we can define also the subnets for both iSCSI 1 and iSCSI 2. There is also a feature in PetaSAN that allows it to automatically assign IP addresses for new disks we create instead of us having to manually assign it. It's optional. And in this case, we need to enter a from range and a to range, which is a pool of IP addresses that allows PetaSAN to automatically assign IP addresses for new disks. In our case, we will be using the default configuration on this page, so we will not change any of the values. So we'll just accept them. Now it's time to create our first disk. So we go to the Manage iSCSI Disks and click on Add iSCSI Disk. We need to specify a disk name like VM data, for example. We specify the size, for example, like 250 gigabytes. And then we need to define how many active passes we would require for this disk. In PetaSAN, all passes are active. We can specify up to 8 active passes in this current version. However, since we are only using 3 nodes, probably it doesn't make sense to have that many passes. So we'll just use 2. Then we need to define on which subnets these passes would be allocated. And in our case, we can choose first subnet or second or both. So in our case, actually most of the time you would be using both. Of course, if we had many nodes, storage nodes, we can increase the active passes to, for example, 8. 4 would be allocated on one subnet, and then 4 would be allocated on the other subnet. Then we can either manually enter the IP addresses, or we can have them automatically assigned. For simplicity, just say auto assign. And we can also input some password authentication, which we will not do. So let's create our first disk. Now we can see that the disk is put into our disk list, and it shows a status of starting. And once the status turns to started, it means that the actual disk is actually functioning. We can view the active passes for that disks by clicking on the active passes link here. It shows us that our 2 paths have been assigned to node 1 and node 3, and they also have allocated the IP addresses on 2 different subnets. These are the IP addresses that the client would be using while connecting to our disk. Also note that the IQN is actually the base IQN that has been defined in our configuration, and appended to it is the index of the disk. There's also some things that we can do, like we can start and stop the disks here. We can delete it, resize it, edit it. We also can have a search here in case we have a large number of disks. We can search on using different criterias, like search by name, by size, by date, and so on. Also, all these column names are all sortable, so we can sort by whichever parameter we want. Okay, that was a brief overview of how to set up a PetaSAN system and create a disk. I hope you liked it. Of course, we have more information in our quick start guide, which you can download from our website. And also, if you do have any problems, please give us a shout on one of our forums. Thank you.